to the work that they are doing, or it is just kind of an overview. So those are the things that is really important to first understand before you even start with your so these are the things that you really need to keep in mind before you even start preparing for your presentation. So first, the audience, who they are, what do they want to know, and then what will they want to know from your talk, from your presentation. Again, these second and third points are kind of pretty interrelated. And then what do you want to tell them about your work? So that is also very important, right? So based on, again, the audience, there are things that you want to talk about more than the others. And again, what would interest them more? Those are the things that you have to be really mindful before you actually start preparing for your talk, be it a PowerPoint presentation, a poster presentation, or an oral presentation. So once you have the audience in mind, the next step is planning your presentation. Now, a presentation can be easily ruined if the structure is too complicated. Now, and what I mean by that is that when you start talking, first of all, the first thing that you talk is the background, right? Now, again, keeping the audience in mind, it is extremely important to kind of outline what you want to incorporate in the background. Now, if they are students, like who may need a little more introduction to the topic, then you may want to include a little more of the background. And if they are professionals who are fairly aware of the work that you're presenting, then you may not need to include a lot of the background information. So again, that is critical. And again, it based on the audience, you will choose, the structure. But at the same time, it is very important that you do not make it too complicated and keep it simple. That kind of flows well and helps to keep the audience engaged as well, because it helps to understand better. So the next point is organizing your thoughts. So what I mean by that is you will have different topics to talk about in your presentation, like the hypothesis, the results, the methods, the discussion, and the overall
Are you seeing the question, Dr. Sen?
I do see. Is it possible for you to repeat that one more time?
Julian, do you want to break in and ask the question?
Sure. So say you expect to give an audience to some type of demographic, but when you go actually give the presentation, like you've been preparing for the demographic you were thinking of, but when you go to the presentation, you see an unexpected demographic. How would you accommodate to that demographic while keeping the content of the presentation the same?
That's a good question, but a lot of times, like when we give a talk, we are pretty much aware of where we are giving the talk, right? So you will be filled with all that information where you are giving the talk, like whether it is in a school or whether it is in a professional setting or if it is in a healthcare, so you have kind of a fair idea about the audience ahead of time. So that kind of really helps you to prepare, your content of your presentation ahead of time, because you will have a pretty good idea where you are presenting, right? So that should help you to prepare. And in case if you just go and see, like there could be some who you think, then I'm sure they will have questions, and you should be able to answer those questions based on their needs. Does that answer?
He's nodding yes, so I think we're in good shape.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the next thing is organizing your thoughts, right? Again, as I was talking about it, it is extremely important to have that outline before you actually give the talk, right? So when you are preparing, have an outline. And then the most important thing, again, is transition. So you will have different topics to cover in your presentation, but if, for example, even in the background, when you are talking about something, it is extremely important to have a good connection when you move to the next. So you're talking about one thing, and then when you move to the next sentence, even, like there has to be a nice flow. It should not be that, like you're talking about one thing and then you're bringing something else again, because that kind of ruins the presentation and also the flow. And the audience kind of loses interest because they don't seem to follow very well, because a lot of times there could be some, right, who are not familiar with the topic. And we have experienced that, and I myself have experienced that too many times, that it is a little hard to follow, like when there is, when the flow is not really proper. So that is one thing, keep in mind that it is extremely important that every time you're talking about that, like there is a nice flow and a nice connection with what you have just said. So keep that in mind. And then, I will come to more of that detail in my next set of slides, but I think a few things that I want to talk about first, because a lot of times when we give oral presentation, we have to make PowerPoint slides, right? So a few things that you have to be really mindful of when you make those slides are, number one, the font size. So that is something that I have experienced many times when I have gone to talks, and that is like the fonts are really, really small, and there are too many things on one slide, and it is extremely hard to follow, like because the presenter knows the topic but not everybody else, right? So when they are going over, like it is extremely difficult to follow when the slide is too crowded, right? And when there are too many things on a slide. So number one is, first of all, I will come to having too many things on a slide later on, but number one is the font size. Have a font that, like audience who are at the back is able to see what you have on the slide. So that is very important. Make it very clear. Next, use bullet points and not complete sentences. And a common standard, or it's like about 6 to 7 bullet points on one slide. And what I mean by do not include complete sentence is that, like just have one heading and then you can elaborate on that as you move on, right? So what that does is, like it engages the audience less on the slide and more on the presenter. So they are not reading the slide as you are talking, right? So what happens then is that they are reading and the audience is, the presenter is talking, and, like there is kind of a disconnect, right? So have important bullet points on the slide. And also there are like click to add notes at the bottom. If you want to have that for your own reference, you can do that too, but do not include a lot of the content on the slide, because that again, as I said, like that reduces efficiency, and it helps to kind of have the audience look at the presenter and understand better. So the next point is, this is kind of, it's up to the presenter, but I prefer not to use too much of contrasting colors on the slide. That kind of is a little distracting too. So avoid using too much of contrasting colors such as green, red, and things like that. And also do not use special effects too often. You can use that sparingly, but not too often. And again, another thing for the presenter is avoid reading from the screen. And that is, again, what I mean by, like, when I just referred to as having bullet points. That kind of really helps the presenter as well from reading from the screen, right? And that kind of engages the audience more, because when the presenter is having more of an eye contact with the audience, that keeps both engaged, right? So keep that in mind, that, like, do not have a lot of text on the slide, which is very important, because otherwise it gets very, very distracting. And then, the next is, you have a pointer. You can use a pointer when it is necessary, and it is very helpful. And I have seen from my own personal experience that there are many presenters who do not use a pointer. And it kind of, it's especially on a slide which has the data or the results, right? Because a lot of times it is hard for the audience to exactly understand the data. So having a pointer and exactly pointing to what you are talking about is very helpful. So extremely important to have a pointer. And then one thing again is talking about your results, and then I will come to that more, but graph. So a lot of our work actually involves showing data in the form of graph, right? So which has like Y and X axes, and then all these different parameters, right? Like all the different bar graphs, and then the combinations that we are referring to and we are comparing. So it is very, very important to spend a lot of time on the graph that, or the data that you are talking about. That really helps the audience to understand what you have accomplished or what you have done. And this is again from my experience. I have been to many talks where the presenter just kind of, you know, like talks about the data, and it is extremely hard to follow what they are talking, what they are comparing, you know, whether it is going up, down, or if they are seeing a difference in their analysis, you know. So please spend a lot of time on every figure that you are presenting. Explain the y-axis, explain the x, and then what is on the graph, you know, like all the different, if for example, you're doing an experiment where you have different treatment groups, and make sure to explain all the different treatment groups that you have on the graph, what you were comparing to, and if you have done any statistical analysis at the end, you know, like, which typically we put it on the graph, right? We put it in the form of p-values, right? So you have to go over those details very well, you know, like if your comparison, what you're comparing, if it is significant or if it is not, and that kind of reflects on the p-values that you are putting up on the graph. So those are that's one thing that I personally like to spend a lot of time when I present my work. Next is go to the next slide. Okay, so another thing which is very normal, and I have had this too, is getting nervous, right? So that is something we all do, and as much as you give presentations, this is something, it never ends. It just still exists, right? And I remember giving my first presentation when I came to this country. It was a lab presentation, and I kind of just felt that I wish this day did not exist, because I was so nervous. I panicked about talking in front of a big group. But I think as you kind of give presentations, and the more you do, it kind of get over the nervousness or the fear of talking in public, and which is fantastic. So do not hesitate to give a presentation. The more you do, the better it is, you know, like, and it really helps with your public speaking skills too. And then when you give a talk, be excited about your work, because nobody knows your work better than you do, right? So be excited to talk about what you have done, the data, the results that you got from your work, you know, even if it is negative, because negative data is also as equally important as positive data, right? You know, like a lot of times it can be that, you know, like we don't end up getting results as we expect, but it is extremely important to share those negative data as well and publish that work, because if somebody else is trying to work in a pretty similar area, and, you know, at some point may want to do something similar, and you know, like as they go over the, you know, like published work, then they can see that, you know, like, oh, this is something which did not work and it has already been published. So it is extremely useful and beneficial to even talk about negative data as much as we are excited to talk about positive data. Then the other thing is to speak with confidence. So as again, from my own experience, as I kind of started giving more presentations, it helped me to get over the fear, knowing that I think nobody knows my work better than I do, right? So that kind of helped me to build the confidence every time I went to give a talk. And I think it is important, right, that, like you speak with confidence. So it kind of gives a good vibe to the audience as well. So make sure to speak with confidence. And another important thing that I feel is very critical and important is make good eye contact with the audience. So that helps to really keep the audience engaged. A lot of times, like if you have too much, as I just mentioned, if you have a lot of text on your slide, then you tend to just look at the slide and not at the audience, right? So that doesn't leave a very good feeling. So it is important to make a nice eye contact and just kind of spread it around, like move over the entire hall and just make nice eye contact with pretty much the entire crowd who is there attending the talk. Next. So again, so the next important thing is the content, right? So what do you want to include in your presentation? So which is very important. So the first slide that you start with is the title of the talk, and have that in nice big font. And beneath that, you have your name and the organization that you come from, and the date. That's kind of a standard that we typically do. You don't have to put the date, that is not critical, but having a title that is, can be read by the audience who are sitting at the back, that is important. Having your name and also the organization that you come from, right? So that's the first slide. So the next slide is either the background or the introduction. And again, as I said, keeping the audience in mind, you have to enter the bullet points on the background, right? So if you think that, like you're speaking to a set of audience who need more information about the background, then include a little more detail. And even it does not have to be on the slide, right? You can actually talk more about the background information than, excuse me, than the others who may not need that information, right? So having a nice and clear background based, keeping in mind the audience is important. And at the same time, having a nice flow, even in the background that you are presenting, is extremely important. What you have just talked, and then, like you go to the next, and then in the background, a lot of times we talk about work that has already been published, right? Because our work is always in continuation to what has been published or what has been done. So it is important to talk about some of those work that has already been published. So that kind of also suggests that what you're doing is important, because others are also working in that particular area, may not be the same work, right? So make sure to have that very clear in your introductory slide or in your background slide. Next, even in the background, a lot of times, like we use abbreviations, which is absolutely fine. And as you move on in your presentation, you can continue. It is necessary. I didn't really read that very well.
So the question they're asking is it necessary to include a citation/reference page in your PowerPoint?
It is absolutely fine. It is not necessary, but it is absolutely fine to include citations. And it is actually, I would say it is good to include citations, especially in the background. When you are talking about somebody else's work, then you always add a reference and include, it doesn't have to be really big. When you include references, even on your background slide or on any slide, it does not have to be really big, and if somebody wants, they can just take a picture of your slide, and they can later on refer back. But it is I would say important to use references, because a lot of times on the background or anywhere else, if you're talking about somebody else's work, it is good to acknowledge their work and add the reference if it is already published. Okay. So in continuation, next is the abbreviations, right? So a lot of times people are not clear about, I mean, or rather people do not kind of say it out, you know, like, and just use abbreviations, and it is hard to follow, right? And I have had from my own experience, I had to ask, you know, like, what does this mean, you know? So it is important. So on the background, if you would be using those abbreviations later on in your presentation, have that, you know, like spelled out on the background slide first, and then you can use, you know, subsequent slides, you can use abbreviations as you move on. It is absolutely fine, but you have that on the first slide. Next is, so once you have the background, you know, like, or the introduction, you have talked about it. The next is the hypothesis, right? So you should have your hypothesis in the next slide and not have it continuation on the same background slide, because that is the key thing that you are working on, right? So you should have a slide that is entirely dedicated to a hypothesis, you know, like in a couple of words. You can have that, you know, it doesn't have to be bullet points, because, right, because that's the most important thing of your presentation. So have a slide with the hypothesis, you know, like laid down, you know, like very clearly, so people really understand what you are working on. So that is the key thing in your presentation, and have it very clear in a nice and fresh slide. So after your hypothesis, you next start to talk about what you have done. So a lot of times, many presenters actually give a detail about the methodology section, you know, of what they have worked on, right? And I feel that it is too much, because first of all, it's a lot to include on the slide, and the audience, it's too much for them to read. So what I prefer personally, and from my experience hearing many talks, is from the hypothesis, you can give a very brief background, you know, like on, for example, certain labs work with human cell lines, or work with tumor samples, or on any samples, right? So right after your hypothesis, you can talk about what are the samples that you have worked with in your project, or what you're presenting, right? So you can say that, you know, like, this is the hypothesis, and we have tested them in such and such samples. It could be cell lines, and then you have tested them in tumor samples, or many labs do in vivo work in mice. Then you can talk about, you know, like, this was conducted in an in vivo setting and tested in mice, where, you know, like, mice were treated with different drugs and whatever you have used for your work. So give a brief, you know, like, or talk about what the samples were briefly here, and then go to the results. So don't talk about the methods, you know, in detail, but you can talk about the methods when you go to the results section. So in the results, you start showing your data, right? And many labs actually do data analysis, you know, like data which already exists. They take the data, and then they analyze on those data, and then kind of present new data, right, based on the hypothesis that they are working on. So, which is absolutely the way to go. And so the first figure you have, you know, or the results section will have the first figure. And that's when that you, as I said, you know, like, spend time on the results section, because that is the most important thing, right? So at this point, you can talk about what you have used for this particular figure, whether they are cell lines, tumor samples, in vivo, data analysis, whatever. And then you talk about every axis that you have on the slide very clearly, go over all the comparisons that you are doing. And again, as I said, use a have a pointer, so it is easy for the audience to understand. And spend time, you know, like, and as you are moving from one bar to the next, or there could be 2 bars next to each other where you are doing comparison, right? So have those things very clear when you are presenting. And at the same time, before you actually go right into explaining the data, you can say that, you know, like, for this particular experiment, you have used cell lines or tumor samples, and then they were treated in a certain way, what concentrations were used to treat, and then how did you do the analysis, whether you did a PCR analysis or you have done a Western blot to look at protein samples or any other, whatever you have done. This is the time where you talk about it so that people understand this particular work that you are presenting, and they're able to connect with the methods that you have used, so that's something that I really am fond of, and I really like presenters who present it in this way. So that kind of gives a nice flow. So first talk about what the samples are, and then talk about how you have done a little in detail, and then you talk about what your results are, okay? And then if you have done any statistical analysis, you can actually talk about that, and you also make sure to have that information on the slide if you have any p-values and what that actually means, and make sure to know everything. And another important thing is whatever you have on your slide, make sure to know everything that you are putting there, because the audience can ask you questions, and it is embarrassing if you do not know what you're putting on the slide. So only put things that you think you understand, what you are putting there, what the comparison or anything, even p-values, like make sure to know the statistics behind how the analysis is done, what it actually means, right? Because there could be questions, right, from people, again, who do not really understand this topic very well, and they may want to know more. So that is extremely important. So next is, once you have done that, done the results, so go over each data, like have one. And again, one thing that I have seen from my own personal experience is that many presenters put many data on the same slide, and it is extremely stressful for me too, because it is hard to understand. The fonts are so small, and like they jump from one figure to the other. They have like one A, B, C, D, E on the same slide, right? And it is very difficult. At the most, you can have two, one next to each other, but make sure that your letters that the fonts are legible. So you can have two on one slide, and then even if they are CD, have continuation. You can say like continuation of figure 1 and have it on the next slide. But don't make it too crowded, because that it's very distracting, stressful for the audience. So you want your work to be, like it's an exciting thing that you're presenting, right? And you want the audience to be equally excited about what you're talking about. So, so once you have, go over all of your data one after the other. And once you have presented all of the data, the final slide is the conclusion slide. So that is very important too, right? Because you are finally talking about what you have concluded from your own work, and have those, keep that a little more elaborate, because even if you add a little more text there, it is okay, because that is your work, and and it helps the audience to also understand, so it doesn't have to be exactly bullet points, right, in the conclusion. So you can have a little more text in our conclusion slides, but don't make it too crowded. Like if you need more room, you can go to the next slide, so that like the audience can read better. But again, have the conclusion slide very clear, very relevant to what you have achieved. And you can also, this is the time when you can kind of refer to some of the work that has already been done, and say how your work relates to the work that has been done, or it is something different. It's a different observation that you have got, then which does not really align to what is already published. So that is something, it's very important, right? So spend time on the conclusion slide too, and that's something you can refer, and you can also add a few references here if you are referring to any work that has already been done earlier, and but make it very clear, because that is the key of your work that you are presenting. So once you have the discussion or the conclusion slide, the next slide is the acknowledgement. Now, this is something some people do very much in detail, and which is absolutely fine, because you also want to acknowledge people who have been involved in this project, right? The PI, if you're working in a lab, the PI, the people in the lab who helped you with the project, with any analysis, understanding. At the same time, a lot of times we have collaborators who we collaborate with, right? And it is extremely important to acknowledge them as collaborators in the acknowledgement slide. Also, we have funding agencies who fund the work. So it is also extremely important to list the different funding agencies who are funding the work that you are actually doing. So that's the acknowledgement slide, and that's where the presentation ends. So if anybody has any questions about what I have talked so far. If not, I will kind of talk a little more about, so this is more about oral presentations, right? A lot of times we also have poster presentations, and that is also very, very common, and that is equally important as oral presentations, because many times, especially in conferences, like they are not able to accommodate everybody to give an oral presentation, right? So many people, like I have given many poster presentations in many different conferences as well. So it is extremely important. Poster presentation is equally important as oral presentation. And I'm sure you will also have many as you move along. So what are the things that are needed in a poster presentation? So first is the poster title. Again, like as I talked about in an oral presentation, having the poster title is extremely important. Next, have names of all the people who have helped in the project. Your name starts first, or whoever is presenting the work has their name listed first on the poster. And and then have the name of the organization and have the complete address beneath. Okay, so that goes at the top of the poster. And that next you come to the abstract. So having an abstract in a poster is extremely important, which you do not need in an oral presentation. But in a poster, it is extremely important to have an abstract. And what that means is it includes all the work that you have done in the project, in your project, and that you are presenting. Okay, so it kind of talks about a little bit about the background, and then you talk about why you are doing this, and then you talk about the results, and then final conclusion. So that kind of is a gist of all the work that you are presenting. So first have the abstract. Next, you can have the introduction, like the oral presentation, that will have a little more detail, like on the background. And again, you can include based on where you are presenting, as I said. So have the background on the slide, on the poster. Then have materials and methods. So materials and methods section is very important in a poster presentation. And you should kind of include details about all the methods and the materials that you have included in your work. So that needs to be elaborate in a poster. Then you talk about the results section. And that is, again, very important, right? So you have to present all the figures that you are talking about, or the data. You have to present all the data in the form of figures that you are presenting in your work. And that the way it happens is, for every figure, there has to be a title, and then you have your figure, and then there has to be a figure legend where you include what you have used in this particular data, the cell lines, if at all, or tumor samples or anything, how they have been treated, the time point, how they have been analyzed, everything is in the figure legend. So for every figure, a title first, and then the figure, and then the figure legend. Okay, so that's how the results section goes. And then you have a conclusion or a discussion slide or discussion section on the poster, like your oral presentation. And it does not have to be extremely elaborate, nor it has to be short, like you just have to include the most important observations from your study in the conclusion slide. And then you have the acknowledgement, again, like the oral presentation, just list, like thank the PI and all the collaborators and the funding agency, and have all of that in the acknowledgement slide. So this is all about a poster presentation, and then, like in a poster, again, I'm sure you have done it many times. You just have to stand in front of the poster, and when somebody comes to your poster, you just have to explain what you have done, and there will be questions from them. A lot of times posters are judged, so it is very important to kind of make a nice poster and make it very attractive, and include, and also the content in a poster is also very important, right? Because a lot of times they are judged, and there are awards that go with a good poster presentation too. So be mindful of that too, based on where you are presenting. And doesn't matter, like even if it does not attach an award along with it, but it's just for your own satisfaction. It is extremely important to make it right and do it the right way, right? So that's all I have to talk about giving good oral and poster presentations. If anybody has any questions, you can.
Karan has a question, Dr. Sen.
Okay.
It
Yes.
says, since our presentations will be online for this program, probably on Zoom, would you suggest incorporating any online tools? For example, would you suggest annotating the slide instead of using a pointer, or using polls in the beginning to engage the audience?
Including what? I didn't get that. Including what was that?
So the second half is, for example, would you suggest annotating the slide instead of using a pointer, or using polls in the beginning to engage the audience?
You know what? I mean, typically, even if it is online, I'm extremely sorry that I'm not able to show my slides today. But what I can do is that, like I can forward my presentation slides to each of you, so that it kind of gives a list of what needs to be included. But I think from my own personal experience and seeing, like how it is being done right now, it is good to have, you can use your computer pointer as you are going on, you don't, and just explain. So that kind of gives a better depiction of what you are saying, right? And helps the audience to understand better. And I think it is not too difficult to use the pointer as you talk about in the, even if you go online. I personally would prefer that.
Great. Any other questions? Erica has a question. For oral presentations, I noticed that no matter how much I practice my presentation, I still get nervous while presenting, and I end up talking much faster than I should. Do you have any advice for how to handle this? Absolutely.
And this is something very common, as I said, and in my almost like 20 years, I would think, or even more, 25 years of being in the area of research, where I have given many presentations and still continue to do so, I still get nervous. And even today, before talking to all of you, I would not deny that, but again, I think what is from my own personal experience, what I did before a presentation was practice at home. I would have so I would have a timer. I would set a timer, and I would close the room, set the timer, and keep practicing. So that kind of really, because I know ahead of time how much I can talk for, right? Like I have the time that's for every presentation that I should talk for, right? So I have that information ahead of time. So what I do is that I set a timer at home, and then I talk. And if I feel that, like I have been too fast and I have like a lot of time left, then I will slow my pace. So practice at home before every presentation, like do it a week before, and then take about a week to practice. And that's how, from my own experience, that's how I did it. A week I would actually practice every time I would, like from work, I would come home, and before I went to bed, I would actually just do this, and make sure that, I'm able to keep up with the time. So that is one way, I think, which is really helpful. So you can practice on your own. A lot of times, if you have your friends who has the time to listen to your presentation, that is another way to do it. Talk in front of your friends, talk in front of your family. You can also talk in front of your family, even if they may not be able to understand everything that you are talking, but that really helps to get over the fear and the nervousness, I think.
That was great. And just to follow up on that, our last week of the program, before you give your presentations, you will have opportunities to give practice talks as well. So take advantage of that too, and we can give feedback. And because you're sitting at home, I like to have like a cup of tea or water. That slows me down for whatever reason. But there are different techniques you can try for those too.
Absolutely. And I can actually share the slides that I have that, so it kind of whatever I have talked about, when you have them in front of you, it helps to kind of, it gives some reference, right, that you can refer to.
If you send those to Solomon, we'll post them on our Google Classroom, and then all the students will have them.
Sure, I can do that.
Perfect. Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you, Dr. Sen, for talking to us in this remote setting. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the students did as well.
Good luck to all of you.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Sure, bye.